Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you are reading with Jimmy. We're reading part three of 8 parts of an epic poem called Beowulf. Hopefully, you got through the first 2 parts. Isn't this exciting? This is translated by Burton Raphael. We left off Beowulf and his Geats were joining the Danes, and they were drinking in the mead hall because Beowulf had landed, and what he wants to do is he wants to fight Grendel, the monster. So Eunfrith spoke, Eglif's son, who sat at Hrothgar's feet. He spoke harshly and sharp, vexed by Beowulf's adventure, by their visitor's courage, and angry that anyone in Denmark or anywhere on earth had ever acquired glory and fame greater than his own. So you see, even in those days, there were people who were jealous, right? Unferth, he says, "You're Beowulf, are you? The same boastful fool who fought a swimming match with Brecca." Now, we may not know these names, but that's okay. Follow along. With Brecca, both of you daring and young and proud, exploring the deepest seas, risking your lives for no reason but for the danger? All older and wiser heads warned you not to, but no one could check such pride. With Brecca at your side, you swam along the sea paths, your swift-moving hands pulling you over the ocean's face. And then winter churned through the water. The waves ran you as they willed, and you struggled 7 long nights to survive. And at the end, victory was his, not yours. The sea carried him close to his home, to southern Norway, near the land of the Brondings, where he ruled and was loved, where his treasure was piled and his strength protected, his towns and his people. He promised to outswim you. Bonswin's son made the boast ring true. You know, you've been lucky in your battles, Beowulf, but I think your luck may change if you challenge Grendel. Staying a whole night through in this hall, waiting where the fiercest of demons can find you. So it sounds like Unfreth, which is Ecgfleth, remember they like genealogy, is really jealous of Beowulf, and he reminds of when he had this race with Brecca when they were younger. Brecca won. Beowulf answered, Ethgro's great son. Ethgro is Beowulf's father. So we know who his father is, right? And we know who Beowulf's father is. Ah, Unfreth, my friend, your face is hot with ale. And your tongue is tied to tell us about Brecca's doings. Tried, pardon me. But the truth is simple. No man swims in the sea as I can, and no strength is a match for mine. As boys, Brecca and I had boasted, and we were both too young to know better, that we would risk our lives far out to sea. And so we did. Remember, when you're young, you do foolish things, right? That's true of even way, way, way long ago when we're reading this epic poem. Each of us carried a naked sword prepared for whales, or the swift, sharp teeth and beaks of nettlefish. Nettlefish. I should have looked that on up, huh? So they carried naked swords so they could defend themselves. He could never leave me behind, swim faster across the waves than I could, and I had chosen to remain close to his side. I remained near him for 5 long nights. Can you imagine them swimming in the cold ocean of Norway and Denmark? Now, way up north, these are Vikings. Until a flood swept us apart. The frozen sea surged around me, and it grew dark. The wind turned bitter, blowing from the north, and the waves were savage. Creatures who sleep deep in the sea were stirred into life, and the iron hammered links of my mail shirt, these shining bits of metal woven across my breast, saved me from death. So not only is he swimming in the sea, in the cold sea, he's got his armor plate on, right? He's got his armor plate, the mail shirt. A monster seized me and drew me, let's continue here, swiftly toward the bottom, swimming with its claws tight in my flesh. But fate let me find its heart with my sword, hack myself free, and I thought that that was the beast's last battle. And I fought that beast's last battle and left it floating lifeless in the sea. So Beowulf tells the story of what happened, what the real truth was, according to Beowulf, with Breca. Now, who's narrating the story? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's the third person narrator. So he's telling us, this friend said this. Yeah, right? And then Beowulf said this. No. We got split apart here. That's what happened. Chapter 9. Still quotation. So Beowulf's still speaking. Other monsters crowded around me, continually attacking, and I treated them politely, offering them the edge of my razor-sharp sword. Beowulf's pretty cocky. But the feast, I think, did not please them. The feast. I treated them politely. I offered them my sword. So it did not please them, fill their evil bellies with no banquet-rich food, thrashing there at the bottom of the sea. And by morning, they decided to sleep on the shore. In other words, they were washed ashore. He killed them all. Lying on their backs, their blood spilled out on the sand. Afterwards, sailors could cross the Red Sea, the sea road, and feel no fear. Nothing would stop their passing. So Beowulf actually cleaned the sea of these monsters. And then God's bright beacon appeared in the east. The water lay still, and at last I could see the land. Wind-swept cliff walls at the edge of the coast. Fate saves the living when they drive away death by themselves. Jimmy put a little arrow there. Think about this. Fate saves the living when they drive away death by themselves. In other words, fate, that's fate, but he drove away death. Lucky or not, 9 was the number of these sea-huge monsters that I killed. What man anywhere under heaven's high arc has fought in such darkness and endured more misery or been harder pressed? So he's taking a bow, right? He's taking a bow. Killed 9 monsters. And yet I survived the sea, smashed the monster's hot jaws, swam home from my journey. The swift-flowing waters swept me along, and I landed on Finnish soil. Right? I've heard no tales of you, Unfred, telling of such clashing terror, such contests in the night. So now he's turning it back to Unfred. I haven't heard what you've done, right? Breca's battles were never so bold, and neither he nor you can match me. And I mean no boast. I've announced no more than I know to be true. So I'm not bragging, I'm just telling you the truth. And there's more. You murdered your brothers, your own close kin. Beowulf's flipping it now. Words and bright wit won't help your soul. You'll suffer hell's fires, Unfred, forever tormented. Eglif's proud son, if your hands were as hard and your heart as fierce as you think, no fool would dare to raid your hall and ruin Hera and oppress its prince as Grendel has done. So Beowulf's throwing it right in his face and saying, if you were so tough, right, Grendel would have never thought of raiding your Hera, the mead hall. That's the name of the hall. But He's learned that terror is his alone, and he discovered that he, Grendel, can come for your people with no fear or reprisal. He has found no fighting here, but only food. And what is Grendel's food? Yes, the people, the men, and only delight. He murders as he likes, with no mercy, and he gorges and he feasts on your flesh. And he expects no trouble, no quarrel from the quiet Danes. But now the Geats will show him courage, and soon he can test his strength in battle. And when the sun comes up again, opening another bright day from the south, anyone in Denmark may enter this hall, and that evil will be gone. So Beowulf is basically telling him, if you're so tough, Grendel would have never came, but now he's going to have a fight on his hands. And why is the narrator telling us this through Beowulf? Well, first of all, to remind us how vicious the monster is. He gorges on your flesh, right? On your flesh. Hrothgar, gray-haired and brave, sat happily listening, the famous ring giver sure at last that Grendel could be killed. He believed in Beowulf's bold strength and the firmness of his spirit. So Hrothgar, right, he's the king here, he's just enjoying the Beowulf-Unferth conversation. Jimmy always tells you that you should read literature to learn how other people lead their lives and how to lead your own, right? Well, once in a business situation, when Jimmy was at a corporate client, the corporate client had his bigger, much larger agency guy in the room. And he and I were basically battling with words about advertising. And the corporate VP that was our mutual client was just sitting there like Hrothgar, enjoying the conversation. And it pretty much went like this, because we were studying this client's advertising. We had a certain methodology that could measure response rates and from readership studies. It's a long story. I won't bore you. But in any case, this agency guy who didn't have the ruler, we did, the measurement. And, knowledge is power. Please don't forget that. Knowledge is power. Now, Beowulf here is relying on his strength. I was relying on the ability of our formula to measure the impact of the client's advertising. So when we got into a big argument about what is effective advertising, and people still argue that today, we were going back and forth, and I would notice every now and then my client smiling because he was enjoying it, just like Hrothgar must have been enjoying this little dialogue between Beowulf and Unferth, right? He was enjoying it, but he was secretly glad because now Grendel's going to meet his match, theoretically. And that's the same thing that happened with my client. There was one point when, I was proving to him that he made really, really bad advertising that didn't generate response, because I was the direct mail guy. And he says, I don't know, blah, 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 blah. How you? I said, well, how do you? And basically I said, well, then just don't make shitty ads. I basically said that. And the client at that point said, okay, that's great. He was smiling and laughing, and he says, that's a great discussion. And we continued. But the point of the story that I just told you about Jimmy's personal experience is that in this case, that's what's going on here. Hrothgar the king is enjoying the challenge that Unferth said. The dialogue. Remember, there's no television, there's no radio. But what you read, actually, when I was battling with the agency guy in front of the client, I did not think of Beowulf. I just thought of that incident now when I'm reading Beowulf, to show you how true sometimes these pieces of literature are. Let's continue. There was the sound of laughter and the cheerful clanking of cups, right, and pleasant words. And then Wealhtho, here's a new character, Wealhtho, Hogarth's gold-ringed queen, greeted the warriors, a noble woman who knew what was right. And she raised a flowing cup to Hrothgar first, holding it high for the Lord of the Danes to drink and wishing him joy in that feast. And the famous king drank with pleasure and blessed their banquet. So Wealhtheow, right, is Hrothgar's wife, the queen. So the king drinks with pleasure and blessed their banquet. And then Wealhtheow went from warrior to warrior, pouring a portion from the jeweled cup for each until the bracelet-wearing queen. You see how they use these hyphenated words? The bracelet-wearing queen had carried the mead cup among them, and it was Beowulf's turn to be served. So that's part of the tradition, the rituals that go on in the mead hall, right? The queen, serves the king first with a drink from the jeweled cup. Then she goes down and she pours it for each war. They take a little in their cup. She pours for them. She comes to Beowulf, right? Until it was Beowulf's turn to be served. She saluted the Geats. Great prince. So she salutes Beowulf and she thanks God for answering her prayers, for allowing her hands the happy duty of offering mead. Mead is ale, right, like beer, to a hero who would help her afflicted people. He, Beowulf, drank what she poured, Earthgrow's brave son. You see how they put that after the he to make sure you know who he is? Because he is a pronoun. And then assured the Danish queen that his heart was firm and his hands ready. He says, quote, "When we crossed the sea, my comrades and I already knew that all my purpose was this, to win the goodwill of your people or die in battle." You see what he's saying? I'm going to win or I'm going to die. Pressed in Grendel's fierce grip. So I'm going to win or I'm going to die. Let me live in greatness and courage, and here in this hall welcome my death. These people are not afraid to die, are they? Let me welcome my death in this hall if I'm going to die. But I'm going to fight this monster. Wealhtheow was pleased with his words, his bright tongue boasts. So she's pleased with his, not only his words, but that he's boastful. She carried them back to her lord and walked, so he must have said this not to everybody, but to her. She carried the words back to her lord and walked nobly across to his side. And the feast went on, laughter, music, and the brave words of warriors celebrating their delight. And then Hrothgar rose, Helfdane's son, right? Helfdane's son, that's Hrothgar. See how they put that after the name? Kind of like, rather than, it's like a hanging adjective. Heavy with sleep, so he's getting tired. And as soon as the sun had gone, he knew that Grendel would come to Hera. So he knew, as soon as the sun's gone, Grendel's coming. That he would visit the hall when night had covered the earth with its net, and the shapes of darkness moved back, and silence through the world. Hrothgar's warriors rose with him. Okay, so it's nighttime. Remember, it's ancient. There's no street lamps, nothing. And if you've ever been out camping in the country, or right in the country where there are no city lights or anything like that, you know how dark it could get, don't you? It's a beautiful sight because you can see the Milky Way. And on a full moon night, you can see things because the moon lights everything up. Okay, he went to Beowulf, and he embraced the Geats' brave prince. And he wished him well, and he hoped that Herod would be his to command. And then he declared, "No one strange to this land has ever been granted what I've given you," he tells Beowulf. "No one in all the years of my rule. Make this best of your mead halls yours. And then keep it free of evil. Fight with glory in your heart. Purge Herod, and your ship will sail home with its treasure holds full. So he's saying, I'm giving you control of the hall, which is a big thing. Big thing. He's told him he never did this. And he's doing it now because he believes Beowulf is here to kill Grendel. Chapter 10. Then Hrothgar left the hall, and the Danes' great protector, followed by his court, the queen had preceded him, and he went to lie at her side. Seek sleep near his wife. It was said that God himself had sent a sentinel in Herod, brought Beowulf as a guard against Grendel, and a shield behind whom the king could safely rest. It was said, so what was it said? God had brought Beowulf to Herod. You see? It was said. So this is part of the legend of Beowulf. It was said. Who said this? Well, the narrators, third-person narrators telling us it was said. And Beowulf was ready, firm with our Lord's high favor and his own bold courage and strength. So he stripped off his mail shirt, his helmet, his sword, and hammered. This sword was hammered from the hardest iron, and he handed all of his weapons and his armor to his servant. And he ordered his war gear guarded till morning. This is very interesting. Think about this. He's about to fight a monster. He takes off his mail shirt, which is the armor, right? As you've seen that with knights wear. Strips, those are little strips of metal put together. His helmet and his sword. He takes it all and gives it to his servant and says, keep this, right? Till morning. And then, standing beside his bed, he said, Grendel is no braver, no stronger than me, than I am. I could kill him with my sword, but I shall not. Easy as it would be. This fiend is a bold and famous fighter. But his claws and teeth, searching for my shield, his clumsy fists beating at my sword blade, would be helpless. I will meet him with my hands empty. Think about this, what he's saying. He's basically saying he's going to give the monster a chance. I'm going to meet him with my hands empty until his heart fails him, seeing there's a soldier waiting weaponless and unafraid. Let God, this is courage, or is it foolishness? Let God in his wisdom extend his hand where he wills and reward whom he chooses. Let God decide this. And then the Geats' great chief dropped his head to his pillow, and around him, as ready as they could be, lay the soldiers who had crossed the sea at his side, each of them sure that he was lost to the home that he loved. Each of them sure that he was lost. In other words, they probably realize they're going to die because the monster's coming. To the high wall towns and the friends that he had left behind, where both he and they had been raised. Each thought of the Danes murdered by Grendel in a hall, where Geats and not Danes now slept. So his men are not as courageous as Beowulf. But God's dread loom was woven with defeat for the monster. What's that called, ladies and gentlemen? God's dread loom was woven. You know what a loom does? It weaves yarn, right? Was woven with defeat for the monster. So this is called, again, what's it called? Foreshadowing, right? Foreshadowing. Foreshadow. He's telling us in his own way. Sorry for misspelling that. Okay. He's telling us ahead of time what's going to happen. So you should be comforted that now you know, right? That loom was woven the defeat of the monster. Good fortune for the Geats. and help against Grendel was with them. And through the might of a single man, they would win. This is all foreshadowing. The epic poem is actually, the narrator is telling us ahead of time what's going to happen, so you don't stop reading, so you realize that Beowulf's going to win. Who doubts that God, in his wisdom and strength, holds the earth forever in his hands? Remember, this was a Christian time now, right? Christian. Who doubts God holds the earth in his hands? And out in the darkness, the monster began to walk. The warriors slept in that gabled hall where they hoped that he would keep them safe, God, from evil and guard them from death until the end of their days was determined, and that the thread should be broken. The thread should be broken, what? The killing of Grendel. But Beowulf lay wakeful, watching, waiting, eager to meet his enemy, and angry at the thought of his coming. So Beowulf ain't sleeping. He's waiting. Chapter 11. Hold on. Out of the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone that he could trap on this trip to High Heorot. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from the swampland, sliding silently toward the gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's home before, so he knew the way. But never before nor after that night he found Heorot so defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. What's that called? Never before nor after that night did Grendel find it defended so firmly and his reception so harsh. Foreshadowing. So Grendel journeyed, forever joyless. Remember, he's a spawn of Cain. We'll talk about that in the analysis. So he's never happy. Straight to the door and then snapped it open, tore its iron fasteners with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce, and his eyes gleamed in the darkness and burned with a gruesome light. And then he stopped, seeing the hall crowded with sleeping warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together, and his heart laughed, and he relished the sight, intended to tear the life from those bodies by morning. The monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and the feasting his belly would soon know. But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Human eyes were watching his evil steps. I wonder whose eyes they are. Waiting to see his swift, hard claws. Grendel snatched at the first geat that he came to, and he ripped him apart, cut his body into bits with powerful jaws, and he drank his blood from his veins and bolted him down, hands and feet, and death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping the life shut. And then he stepped to another still body, and then he clutched at Beowulf with his claws. But he was grasped at the strong-hearted, wakeful sleeper and was instantly seized himself, claws bent back as Beowulf leaned up on one arm. So Beowulf was next in line to get eaten. Grendel grabs him, and Beowulf grabs him. That shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, that's Grendel, knew at once nowhere on earth had he ever met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. Grendel's one thought was to run from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh and hide there. This was a different Heorot than the hall that he had emptied. But Hygelac follower remembered his final boast, and standing erect, this is Beowulf, standing erect, he stopped the monster's flight, fastened those claws in his fist until they cracked. He clutched Grendel closer. The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but to retreat. I'm done eating, people. I got to get out of here. Desiring nothing but escape, and his claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Herat was a miserable journey for this withering monster. The high hall rang, its roof boards swayed, and Danes shook it with terror. And down the aisles, the battle swept, angry. The battle swept angry and wild. And Herat trembled, wonderfully built to withstand the blows, the struggling of great bodies beating at its beautiful walls. They were shaking the walls of the mead hall. They were fighting so much. Shaped and fastened with iron, inside and out, artfully worked, the building stood firm. Its benches rattled. They fell to the floor. Gold-covered boards grating as Grendel and Beowulf battled across them. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Herat to stand forever, and only fire, they had planned, could shatter what such skill had put together, swallow it in hot flames in such splendor of ivory. So the hall was built well. And then suddenly the sounds changed, and the Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terror. Now remember, the Danes aren't in that hall. They're outside that hall, but they hear all this commotion. In their beds as the terrible screams of the Almighty's enemy sang in the darkness. Who's screaming? Grendel. The horrible shrieks of pain and defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat, Hell's captive caught in the arms of him who was of all the men on earth was the strongest. Oh, so Grendel must be just screaming in terror as he fights Beowulf. Wow, what great language. Chapter 12. That mighty protector of men meant to hold that monster until its life leaped out, knowing that the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. The narrator's unbelievable, isn't he? This fiend is no use to anybody, so Beowulf's going to hold him until his life is done. All of Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds. So the Geats are up, ancestral swords raised and ready and determined to protect their prince if they could. And their courage was great, but it was all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open a path for his evil soul, but their points couldn't hurt him. The sharpest and the hardest iron could not scratch Grendel's skin. For that sin-tainted demon had bewitched all of the men's weapons. So now we got a little black magic going on, don't we? He laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. So isn't it fortuitous that Beowulf decided to put his weapons aside? And yet, his time had come. His days were over, and his death was near. Grendel. Down to hell he would go, swept groaning and helpless to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. Worse fiends than who? Than him. He's going to hell, right? Now Grendel discovered, once the afflicter of men, tormentor of their days, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. That's a great line. So now the evil knows what it's like to feud with God. Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him, and his claws bound fast. In other words, he couldn't get the claws out. Hildegard's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulder snapped. Muscle and bone split and broke, and the battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but he was wounded, and he was good. He could to flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. He who had come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had driven affliction off, had purged Herod clean, and he was happy now that the night's fierce work, the Danes had been served as he boasted he served them, and Beowulf, a prince of the Geats, had killed Grendel. Ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering forced on Horgoth's helpless people by a bloodthirsty feat. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof was hanging high from the rafters, where Beowulf had hung it. It was the monster's arm, claw, and shoulder. Ho! So Beowulf rips this Grendel's arm and shoulder off and then hangs it from the top of the hall. What a battle, huh? I bet you they're happy now, right? Chapter 13. And then in the morning, crowds surrounded Herod, warriors coming to that hall from faraway lands, princes and leaders of men hurrying to behold the monster's great staggering tracks. They gaped with no sense of sorrow. They felt no regret for Grendel's suffering, and they went tracing his bloody footprints, his beaten and lonely flight to the edge of the lake where he had dragged himself corpse-like away, doomed and already weary of his vanishing life. So they followed Grendel's trail to the lake. The water was bloody, steaming and boiling in horrible pounding waves. Heat sucked from his magic vein. But the swirling surf had covered his death, hidden deep in the murky darkness, his miserable end, as hell opened to receive him. Oh. This translation, you got to give the translator credit. Please, give the translator credit. Can you imagine no television, no radio, no internet, no nothing, and you're sitting around listening to somebody narrate this epic poem? I'm getting chills, ladies and gentlemen. Then old and young rejoiced, turned back from that happy pilgrimage. They went down to the lake, and they calls it a pilgrimage, mounted their hard-hearted, hooved, horses, high-spirited stallions, and they rode them slowly toward Herod again, retelling, right? They're retelling about Beowulf's bravery as they jogged along. And over they swore that nowhere on earth or under the spreading sky or between the seas, north or south, was there a warrior worthier to rule over men. But no one, this is important, note the arrow, right? No one meant Beowulf's praise to belittle Hrothgar, their kind and gracious king. Please remember that. They're praising they're telling the story, but they're not belittling the king. The king is still the king. And sometimes when the path ran straight and clear, they would let their horses race, red and brown and pale young backs streaming down the road. And sometimes a proud old soldier who had heard the songs of the ancient heroes and could sing them all through, story after story, he would weave a net of words for Beowulf's victory. So you've got some proud old soldier who knows the songs, right, of the ancient heroes. Remember, they lived on these tales. They told lots of tales. So someone would now weave a net of words of Beowulf. They're making him into a hero, which he is, tying the knot of his verses smoothly and swiftly into places with a poet's quick skill, and singing his new song aloud while he shaped it, the old songs as well. Sigmund's adventures. Sigmund was a figure from Norse mythology famous for slaying a dragon. These are some of the old stories that they would be singing. Sigmund's adventures, familiar battles fought by that glorious son of Vels, and struggles too against evil and treachery that no one had ever heard of, that no one knew except Fitla, who had fought at his uncle's side. So these are all common stories that are beyond our reach and understanding, but you don't have to really know what these are. I gave you one reference of Sigmund. But you should remember, these would be like telling the stories that we tell of not only our ancestors. I could tell you a story about my Uncle Teddy in World War II, but they're stories. A brave young comrade carefully listening when Sigmund's tongue unwound the wonders that he had worked, confiding in his closest friend. They were tales of giants, wiped from the earth by Sigmund's might and forever remembered. Fame that would last him beyond life and death. His daring battle with a treasure-rich dragon. Heaving a hoary gray rock aside, Sigmund had gone down to the dragon alone, and he entered the hole where it hid, and he swung his sword so savagely that it slit the creature through, and it pierced its flesh, and it pinned it to the wall, and it hung it where this bright blade rested. Sigmund's courage and strength had earned him a king-like treasure, brought gold and rich rings to his glorious hands. He loaded that precious hoard on his ships, and then he sailed off with his shining cargo. So they're telling us the story of Sigmund winding in around Beowulf, what he did. They're not confusing these tales. They're just repeating the tales, right? And the dragon dissolved in its own fierce blood. No prince, no protector of his warriors knew power and fame and glory like Sigmund, and his name and his treasures grew great. Hermann could have hoped for at least as much. He was at once the mightiest of men. This is another tale. But pride and defeat and betrayal had sent him into exile with the Jutes, and he ended his life on their swords. So he was killed by this tribe here. That life had been misery after misery, and he spread sorrow as long as he lived, and he heaped troubles on his unhappy people's heads, ignored all the wise men's warnings, and he ruled only with courage. A king born, entrusted with ancient treasures and cities full of strong-hearted soldiers. His vanity swelled him so vile and rank that he could hear no voices but his own. There's the danger. You only listen to yourself. He deserved to suffer and die. So he's talking about Hermann, right? He got pride, full of pride, vanity, all his vanity, right? But Beowulf was a prince, well-loved, followed in friendship, not fear. Hermann's heart had been hollowed by sin. And the horses ran, and when they could, on the gravel path, and morning slid past and was gone. So as they're riding back to the mead hall, they're telling these stories. This is wonderful. The whole brave company came riding to Hera, anxious to celebrate Beowulf's success and stare at that arm. And Hrothgar rose from beside his wife and came with his courtiers crowded around him. And Wealthrow rose and joined him and his wife and queen with her women, and all of them walking to that wonderful hall. What a gathering, huh? Chapter 14. Hrothgar stood at the top of the stairway and stared at Grendel's great claw swinging high from the gold-shining roof. And then he cried, "Let God be thanked! Grendel's terrible anger hung over our heads too long, dropping down misery. But the Almighty makes miracles when he pleases. Wonder after wonder, and this world rests in his hands." I had given up hope. Exhausted prayer, expected nothing but misfortune forever. Herat was empty, bloody. The wisest and best of our people despaired as deeply, and found hope no easier, and knew nothing, no way to end this unequal war of men and devils, warriors and monstrous fiends. One man found it, came to Denmark, and with the Lord's help, did what none of the Danes could do. Our wisdom, our strength was worthless without him. The woman who bore him, whoever, wherever, right, alive now or dead, knew the grace of the God of our fathers and granted a son for her glory and his. Beowulf, best of soldiers, let me take you to my heart and make you my son too. And let me love you and preserve this passionate peace. Let me preserve this passionate peace between us. Remember, these are Geats and he's a Dane, right? They're different tribes. And take in return whatever you want from whatever I own. Here's Hrothgar saying, whatever you want, take it. Warriors deserving far less have been granted as much, given gifts and honor, though they fought no enemy like yours. Glory is now yours, forever and ever. Your courage has earned it, and your strength, and may God be as good to you forever as he has been to you here. So Hrothgar is really, really, really grateful. Would you agree with that? And then Beowulf answered, quote, what we did was what our hearts helped our hands to perform. We came to fight with Grendel and our strength against his. And I wish I could show you here in Heorot his corpse, stretched on this floor. I twisted my fingers around his claw, and I ripped and tore at it as hard as I could. And I meant to kill him right here and hold him so tightly that his heart would stop and would break and his life would spill on this floor. But God's will was against me. As hard as I held him, he still pulled free, and he ran and escaped from this hall with the strength fear had given him. But you remember, fear does strange things to people and monsters. But he offered me his arm. I love the way they talk, right? The way they narrate. He ran, right? But he offered me his arm and his claw, and he saved his life, yet he left me that prize. And paying even so willingly for his freedom, he still fled with nothing but the end of his evil days. And he ran with death pressing at his back, pain splintering his panicked heart, pulling him step by step into hell. Let him burn in torment, lying and trembling and waiting for the brightness of God to bring him to his reward. Unfreth grew quiet. Remember him? Remember him? Gave up quarreling over Beowulf's old battles, stopped all of his boasting once everyone saw proof of the prince's strength. Grendel's huge claw swinging high from Hrothgar's mead hall roof. The fingers of that lonesome hand ending in nails, as hard as bright steel. So hard, they all said, that not even the sharpest of swords could have cut it through, broken it off the monster's arm and ended his life, as Beowulf had done, armed with only his bare hands. So Unfreth gotta shut up. He's gotta shut up. Huh? Chapter 15. And then the king ordered Heorot cleaned and hung with decorations. Hundreds of hands, men and women, hurried to make the great hall ready. Golden tapestries were lined along the walls for a host of visitors to see and take pleasure in. But that glorious building was bent and broken, and its iron hinges cracked and sprung from their corners all around the hall. Only its roof was undamaged when the blood-stained demon burst out of Heorot, desperately breaking Beowulf's grip, running wildly from what no one escapes, death. Struggled and wither as he will. Wanting to stay, we go. Wanting to stay, we go. All beings here on earth, God's earth, wherever it is written that we go, taking our bodies from death's cold bed to the unbroken sleep that follows life's feast. So this is a little sidebar, right? We're all going to die. And then Hrothgar made his way to the hall. It was time, and his heart drew him to the banquet. No victory was celebrated better, by more or by better men and their king. A mighty host and famous, they lined the benches, rejoicing, the king and Hrothgar, his nephew, this is his nephew, toasted each other. They raised their mead cups high under Herod's great roof, and their speech courteous and warm, and the king and the people were one. None of the Danes were plotting. Then no treachery hid in their smiles. So sometimes there was always plots going on, but none of them this time. Everybody was happy. Hilfdain's son gave Beowulf a golden banner, a fitting flag to signal his victory, and he gave him as well a helmet and a coat of mail and an ancient sword. They were brought to him while the warriors watched. Beowulf drank to those presents, not ashamed to be praised, richly rewarded in front of them all. No ring giver, see the hyphen, has given 4 such gifts: coat of mail, ancient sword, helmet, banner. No ring giver has given 4 such gifts, passed with such treasures through his hands, with the grace and warmth that Hrothgar showed. The helmet's brim was bound with bands of metal, rounded ridges to protect whoever wore it from swords that swung in the fiercest battles, shining iron edges in hostile hands. And then the protector of warriors, lord of the Danes, ordered 8 horses led to the hall, and into it 8 steeds with golden bridles. One stood with a jeweled saddle on its back, carved like a king's. You see all the gifts? These are very generous people. One stood with jeweled saddle on its back, carved like the king's war seat. It was a king's war seat, and it had carried Hrothgar. It had carried. This is the king's seat. This is the king's seat, right? The saddle. When that great son of Helfdain rode to war, and each time carried him wherever the fighting was most fierce, and his followers had fallen. Hrothgar was a warrior too in his younger days. And then Beowulf had been honored by both the gifts, and Hrothgar could have given him horses, weapons, and the king commanded him, use them well. You've been reading with Jimmy. Oh, what a reading, right? This is another chapter, another reading in the Beowulf saga, the epic poem. In this section, he kills Grendel, rips his arm off, hangs it from the ceiling, and he's rewarded with much gifts, armor. Be sure to visit and read other classics with Jimmy, but please follow along with our other readings of Beowulf. This was, in fact, chapter 3 of 8. So the next one is going to be chapter 4. We're going to see what happens. By the way, I'll give you a hint. It's not over. I mean, Grendel's dead, don't get me wrong. But it's not over. Thank you for reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. Email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, readingwithjimmy@jimmy.com. Thanks for staying. Be careful and keep exercising your grip, because you never know when you won't be able to use a sword to kill a monster.